Well, I really just so treasure being here together with everybody. There's Amy and Ziv and Yona, and now we can really get started. I so appreciate your being here tonight for this lecture that I've been doing now this is the 25th yard site. Can you believe that? Wow. Tavshin Nun Vav, my father passed away, and that year I was a student in Jerusalem, and I started this annual talk in his memory immediately a year after, really about imagining our texts and Torah and Jewish tradition and what a packaging engineer might say, how a packaging engineer might read these sources, and what kind of intersection there is between Torah, packaging engineering, and packaging as a theoretical concept and construct. My father, Alav Shalom, was a pharmaceutical packaging engineer. He was a food packaging engineer, and he sat with sketches of little bottles and which color glass and what kind of container and what's the presentation of the vibe and the feel of what it is that you're about to purchase, not just how the bottle worked chemically to keep the product ever sustained on the shelf for all that amount of time that it needed to be there. But that was the chemical and engineering part. He would tool the machines and help tool the machines for those packages. He would also think about the package as container and containing the experience. And tonight, with this talk, which has gone through a couple of iterations of titles, so I'm just going to say like the big long one to include everything that I had. Tonight, the title of the talk is Careful with That Matzah, Protecting and Packaging the Mitzvah, Covers, Boxes, and the Seder as a Container. Okay, so here's the way that works. I'm going to be sharing my screen for a lot of the text study and the images that we're going to roll through. And I'm going to start with a little bit of exploration that's going to get us into some packaging history. Because of course, like we were all waiting a couple weeks ago for those Pesach packages to hit the shelves. You know, unless we like order everything and somebody wraps it in brown paper for us and that's our experience of Pesach, which probably is not the reality. We're waiting to see that packaged reality of Pesach. Just think about that for a second as we move into tonight. That the whole experience we have from Pesach, there are packagers and package engineers and package designers that have a lot to say about what this time of year's experience is all about. And people who appreciate that really know that it's the design side in addition to the engineering side of packaging that makes for a huge difference. We're going to go through a little bit of that packaging history into some Torah sources and an exploration of what Torah says about our ancient ancestors' packages for matzah. We're going to see how that and those verses are used to create an experience at the Seder, which is in and of itself a package for matzah. And we're going to talk about the physical packages for matzah itself. And then we're going to talk and pan out about matzah as symbol, but as it relates to the Haggadah, which packages a presentation of matzah as well. So that's our path tonight. I'm going to share my screen, and you know by this point with Zoom, if you want to see just me and my shared screen, you can hit speaker view. I'm going to spotlight my video. And when I share my screen and you hit speaker view, you'll see me and the share screen. If you want to see more than me and the ribbon of people across the top that includes me, or a ribbon of people down the side, you can do that too with gallery view. So I just want to do a check-in about sharing the screen. I'm going to put it up. I'm going to show you the title that I just read, and everybody's going to please give me a thumbs up for the few people I can see in my ribbon to let me know that you can see the Careful with That Matzah. Yes, thank you very much. Okay, So careful with that matzah. Protecting and packaging the mitzvah, covers, boxes, and the Seder as container. This is dedicated to the neshama of my father, Stewart Bolton, packaging engineer, Abba, Shmuel Lev ben David Vieta, Louis Nishmato, and the inspiration I hope that you will find in this tonight is to enrich our Pesach and to understand just what an experience of the world is in broader dimensions, how it's all packaged. Well, we're not the only ones who await the packaged matzah around Pesach time. As a matter of fact, there are two communities in America that may buy more matzah than the Jewish people. And the same goes true in Israel, or just about the same amount. Would you know that the Arab Israeli community waits for matzah every year and buys matzah in massive amounts? And would you know that the African American community, the Black community, they search for the matzah cracker bread? From a blog, this image, this painting of matzah, comes from a blog called The Adventures of One Brown Girl. Expanding to the Hispanic community in LA, here's a box of matzah crackers. Matzah or motzo or matzah with an S is a cracker-like unleavened bread made of white plain flour and water. It's similar in preparation to the Southwest Asian lavash and the Indian chapati. So she's blogging about matzah, about our familiar packaging from Manischewitz, as at least one of the later boxes of Manischewitz. But let's take a walk back through the history of the Manischewitz box. This is the Manischewitz box, 1888. It turns out that corrugated boxes with printing directly on them without labels were quite a thing in the 1880s. This was the beginning of the use of corrugate, very pressed corrugate, not so fluffy and with aerated space corrugate. And these kinds of cardboard boxes were sometimes glued together and sometimes folded in certain places, but then in other spots, certain elements had to be glued on, like the last panel, something around that. So here we're really into the heart of Manishewitz's beginnings, the matzah without an equal. You see the kind of experience that the box wants to sell you. Beware of imitations. You should beware. And they are strictly kosher for Passover, baked by the best modern methods under the most sanitary conditions. So you're talking about this whole world of early boxes and advertisers, because what else is boxed at this time in the world of packaging? Soap, powders, perfumes. Anybody who reads an early history of advertising and how packages fit into the advertising world knows that we're trying to market a whole line of products for people so that they could smell better. They're trying to sell you on the fact that you don't smell very nice. Other food products, of course, that are staples are going to be boxed as well, and other items that are experience items will be boxed. The early corrugated boxes are for cereals and crackers, and the early corrugated boxes are going to be for cigarettes and tobacco products. One of your earliest boxes for crackers, though, is a tin box. In the 1850s, tin and having tins that seal airtight are the more common boxing method that is used on the market. Cardboard is not machined yet, and folding cardboard is not as machined in the world of packaging engineering. Here are biscuits from England, 1857. It's covered by a paper wrapper in the late 1890s. And in Ireland, cream crackers were all the rage. And so you had this box of cream crackers, but it's a tin box. I don't know if you can see it, but there's actually a lid here, and this is more tin than it is cardboard. 1851. They're going to diversify later to corrugated boxes like our 1888, 1887 grape nuts from the C.W. Post Company. And since cereal companies can put grain items and cracker items in cardboard boxes, so too did Manischewitz decide for the first time after the big new machines that could make matzah that they were going to put matzah crackers squared off because of the new machinery into cardboard boxes. The Streitz Company in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, on the Lower East Side, is going to use a different method, and they're going to have one big corrugated carton with a different kind of cardboard, not such a pressed cardboard, and they're going to wrap 5 different pounds in the paper that's a little bit more familiar to people, and they're going to cover that up in their early packaging. But Manischewitz went by way of the cereal boxes that are around. Grape nuts were good, but Post Toasties were kept fresher. The cardboard was thicker, the labeling added freshness, and the flakes themselves were said to be of better quality. You see improved already? We thought everything is new and improved starting in the 1980s, and that sells people. No, 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s already, new and improved. Everything is new and improved on the package. I'd like to meet a product that's not new and improved at one point, right? It's like one of the tricks of the marketers and the packagers. These improved cornflakes are a thick box with labeling on the outside. You see the corrugate and the labeling. That does not keep things as fresh though, because if you really want to talk fresh, you got to figure out what you're going to do to keep that matzah really crispy. As the new machines are created, and this is a vintage shot from the Streitz matzah bakery on Lower East Side. Okay, so the crackers come out, but can you just throw it in cardboard? Streitz decides that they're going to wrap it at first, and they go with this setup here, where they have individual wrapped. Then early on, they show you, oh wow, and now we have a box around the wrapper. So we used to have these just wrappers, but now we have boxes around our wrappers. That's quite a far difference, of course, than the absolutely wrapped up, very, very tightly waxy cover on the Streitz matzah, and later like 5, 6, 10 boxes at a time in big stretches that you could even get at Costco from Manischewitz now for $7.99. Even though Acme and ShopRite advertised a free 5-pound or 10-pound sleeve of matzah for our Seders in the last years as you bought your Pesach food. The whole idea of the matzah box, though, and whether or not it actually keeps the matzah fresh enough, frankly, is still a debate. How do we actually keep matzah fresh enough and protected enough for the Seder? And anybody who's gotten shmor matzah knows that it's so frustrating. You can't find 3 whole round cakes sometimes because somehow this one got shuffled or shifted while another one had enough paper within it that wrapped the handmade matzahs and kept them steady inside the box. Quality control about how much paper wrapping and or string goes around the actual matzah cakes, there's no standard for that in any shmura matzah bakery area of the world, whether it's Brooklyn or it's Bnei Brak. And so people do think about these things though, and they don't want you to have broken matzahs. Actually, the kinder, you really don't want to have broken matzahs. And so you get little kinder matzah. You get smaller boxes, and you can have enough little round matzahs for your kids at your Seder if you want to have like little Seder plate and a little 3 matzahs in front of the kinder, or you just want to give the kinder a matzah at the Seder experience. But and this is a shout out to Bird, who I know always goes to the pupa to get the shmura matzah, though maybe not this year. But the pupa, somehow they have just the right mix of paper within the box that keeps most of the matzah very whole and very protected and very, very much ready for us to use, whether it's the 1 pound box or they have like the 2 pound bakery box with wrappings. 1 year, I don't know if you know this, Bert, but a 2 pound box from them I got also, and it had 2 different wrappings of 1 pound each, as opposed to 1 massive wrapping of 2 pounds of matzah. So they're coming up with different ways, these folks who are not official packaging engineers, but they are trying to figure out, how do we protect this matzah for the Seder if these are the kind of matzahs, and I'm saying that pointedly, if these are the kinds of matzahs that people are going to use for their Seder. And in most religious communities, shmura matzah like this is in fact the matzah in use, but you could have a very different matzah in use as well, which I actually had this year. I bought from a Syrian matzah baker, matzah that's almost like a laffa. And it's frozen, defrost it 7-8 hours, put it in the oven for 3 minutes, and yes, it's like flimsy like a laffa. Doesn't taste as good, but it's really incredible. And so with modern technologies, they can package frozen matzah discs, send it to you overseas, have it put in your freezer, and then the night of Seder, or the day of, if you will, you take it out 7 or 8 hours beforehand, throw it in the oven right before, and you're totally fine and you're great actually with the circle staying intact because they were frozen. But Manischewitz wanted you to know, back when the whole packaging for matzah was developing, the boxes and the wrappings and the way we protect things, if you look here, it's not just me that's interested in highlighting the packaging. Manischewitz actually came out with this spread in several of the Jewish newspapers and the magazines. And it says practically every operation of baking and of manufacture, including packaging, is done by marvelous automatic machinery. Now those words really, really hit the ears nicely. They splash if you're talking about the time when these ads are coming out in the 50s. Marvelous automatic machinery. Now, I'm not going to get into the argument tonight about machine-made matzah versus handmade matzah, but let's just say there's a whole history of whether or not there's acceptance of machine-made matzah versus handmade matzah. Because for ages, handmade matzah is really the only way we have to make matzah. We don't know from machines, and we don't know from matzah baking machines. And when it comes to packaging them, you see the intent here. The broken ones are kind of put on the side, the whole ones are put together. There's a careful tying off of the package, which basically is the way that over the ages, matzah was packaged. We have no pictures of the pre-industrialized paper delivery system for matzah, but there's writings and thoughts about plant leaves being used for keeping matzah safe, and also old scrolls that instead of being repurposed for sacred writing purposes are actually used for religious purposes on Pesach to keep matzah. Because what better to do with old scrolls if you can't write on it than to wrap your matzah for Pesach? Here's the modern handmade matzah baking. You see how the dough is kind of floppy, and then he's going to put that onto the hearth oven, and it's going to crisp up, and he's going to take those out. And you see below him with the wooden crates, the matzah's out in the open, and it's kind of there in its rounds, almost like a box that you would keep vinyl in, right? You imagine a bunch of vinyl records, Lahavdil, that kind of size. They're going basically for that size. And it's all starting with this dough that, of course, is treated very carefully, and you cannot have water and the flour of any sort that you're using be combined with this dough more than 18 minutes. And of course, there's a certain way to press it. One may dip one's hands, according to the Gemara, and press the dough with some water and get it to the point where you can feel that it's ready to be flattened out and baked. But this idea of having certain special dough for the matzah, also, this is what's going to bring us back, way back, to the Torah source that we're going to start with today. Because in fact, it's the dough and how we packaged the dough that might be the first indication of any kind of suggestion of packaging engineering in the Torah itself, not actually the matzah cakes. Though certain commentaries will say it's not just about packaging the dough, that actually they did pack up some matzah, and the matzah they packed up was the leftover matzah from the Pesach meal in the house in Egypt. That will be a little bit of a debate in the commentaries. Are they going to pack up the dough, or are they going to pack up the leftover matzah? Or is it both? So here we go back into the sources of Torah. The essential verse we need is chapter 12, verse 34 of Exodus. Vayisa ha'am et b'tzeiko terem yachmot. Mi sha'rotam tzururot b'simlotam al shichmam. So the people took their dough before it was leavened. Now I have two possibilities here on purpose. The leftovers wrapped in their cloaks upon their shoulders. The other way to read it is the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls wrapped in their cloaks upon their shoulders. You could either read it A, they took dough and leftovers, that is leftovers of the matzah, and they wrapped it in their cloaks and put it on their shoulders. Or they took their dough and their kneading bowls and wrapped those in their cloaks upon their shoulders. Now Rashi, just about the shoulders, wants to give you a spiritual meaning in all this. Why did they put it on their shoulders? Because they wanted to really do a mitzvah, and they loved mitzvot, and so they bore it on their shoulders, as if to say, here we are taking it upon our shoulders. Their cattle, they had so many of them, and they had donkeys, and they could have put it on animals, but instead they put it on their shoulders. But that's not the packaging part. So we'll just say, okay, that was enough for the shoulders piece. What about this word, misharotam? That's the word that I translated either as leftovers or kneading bowls. Rashi opines on that piece of equipment, or not, that it's shayre matzo maror. He says that it's the leftovers that they had from the Pesach meal. So they put that leftover matzah in their sack, or they wrapped it in their cloaks, right? We think about it as a sack, but really what does it say? They put it in their cloaks, and then they carried it out with them. So here's your first prepackaged non-leavened bread. It's the leftover matzah from the Pesach offering. Now what's interesting about it is that your Pesach offering couldn't be left over. You had to finish that. But your matzah and maror, according to Rashi, that was left over and packed into the cloak, and you're on your way, and you have matzah to keep, and you don't want it to break if it's crispy, or if it's not crispy, and it might have been the soft kind. You have it in your cloak, and you can eat it on your way out, and that would make sense because they didn't have time for it to become leavened cakes, so they left, right? But the interesting thing is that, of course, they were told to eat the Pesach offering with matzah. So what is this whole time thing, and where does that fit in? That's the interesting question vis-a-vis this whole setup in Egypt, because they were told days before to take the lamb. They were told days before to actually prepare matzah to eat it with. They were told to have maror available. And then God says, and by the way, you're not going to have dinner tomorrow unless you take leftovers, so eat the bitters and the matzah, whatever else you got for the road. It's not as though like they made up new dough if these are leftovers. But if they did have dough and they were thinking about making bread, where was the dough stored and what was wrapped in the cloak? Ibn Ezra will tell you that in fact it was dough, and what they had, this word misharotam, is not the leftovers like Rashi says, but it's actually a bowl made of wood. Kli eitz. Kamo tanachav misharatecha. It was like the verse in Deuteronomy, your basket, which mentions your basket and your kneading bowl. And what does that kneading bowl look like in the ancient world? This is a replica of about a 2500 BCE wooden kneading bowl. Imagine that this kneading bowl has dough in it that doesn't have time to rise, and I wrap it in my cloak and I put it over my back. So now what do I have? I have a package for my non-leavening dough. The first package for the dough that didn't have time to rise, that will become the matzah of my Exodus journey, is most likely dough that's in this wooden bowl that's covered with a cloak that I somehow can rig to carry myself. And because of my wandering and my journeying, what I've learned how to do is I've learned how to even open my cloak along the way, and I let the sun beat down and potentially bake some of the dough that I might have in 5 different areas of the bowl, in smaller, flattened, thicker than the matzahs we know, smaller flattened dough balls. And so I might be, as a Bedouin, able to do that. And what I've got here is not only one replica, but here's another way that bowl looks. These are also replicas of ancient bowls. And what would happen over time is some residue would be left on them, and you could wipe them clean with a cloth. And I just point that out because if this was a kneading bowl, and this was used for dough that was allowed to rise, I would just have to say that their Pesach cleaning was much different than our Pesach cleaning. You know, they wiped it out a little bit. They were going to use the same kneading bowl for the journey, for the Exodus. It wasn't such a big, nerve-wracking kind of thing. But look at the shape of that bowl and how that might have also worked on their back versus this kind of bowl. Seems like this kind of bowl might fit kind of in the curvature of a human body, wrapped in a certain way, kind of tightly around the waist. This kind of bowl, I don't know, maybe down someone's longer back or torso, but just depending on your physicality, you might have picked a different kind of bowl. But the bowl wrapped in the cloak is my idea of container, package. This was a functional, portable package that was reusable all the time. And when I really liked a bowl, it might stick with me and my family for a long, long time. Now, some might surmise that clay bowls were the bowls that people used for kneading, but that did not lend itself to a Bedouin culture. And bowls like this, that some say were much more ancient than they really are, were really only Philistine era bowls in the time of the kings, substantiated by Israeli archaeologists. I bring you this picture of the Bedouin way of cooking flat matzah, flat breads, with flour, water, and only a pinch of salt, and not even needed for 18 minutes. And anybody who's ever traveled in the Sinai or with the Bedouin for a couple of days, I got the chance to do that several times. This is how you eat bread. And instead of the kneading bowl on the back of someone, which we did carry, having dough in it, what we actually took are bags of flour, because we had canteens and we had water containers that we took along with us. But if I don't really have containers for water and I don't know where my water is coming from and I want to bring dough with me on a next day journey, or I know that I'm the Israelites and I'm leaving for good and I'm not sure where my next water stop is going to be, I might want dough instead of just flour. Though one of the commentaries will say maybe it was flour that they took out of Egypt with them. I don't know if that's true. This kind of method is ancient as a method, and it could be that a tribe would carry one or two of these ancient kind of metal domes that they would put over a fire to quickly slap bread on. In fact, in the Iraqi and Moroccan community in Jerusalem, where I made Seder in 1994, this was the kind of set up right outside the door of the apartment for Pesach, so that you who got 3 dough balls in your hand, flattened them, slapped them on this dome, and a woman or 2 women sitting there shaped them into chamsas. And we had soft chamsa-shaped matzahs for the first Seder. Now, talk about protecting your matzah. You don't really need to protect it. Your packaging doesn't need to protect it a whole lot. If you're talking about carrying dough that can be preserved for the time that you need it, or for the Jewish community, you don't really need to talk a lot about packaging matzah if, in fact, your local community is cooking dough hours before the Seder. And we'll get to a halachic text later that says you had best be careful how many hours before the Seder you make your matzah, because too many hours before is just not kosher for some of the Gaonim, for some of the Babylonian leadership when it comes to the Seder. Did they need packaging like their ancient ancestors? The answer is really no. Why? Because their matzah baking was day of Leil Seder. It was for the first Seder and even the second. It was done right before Seder with dough that I prepare and put on some type of dome like this over a fire, or some kind of communal oven, and slapped it on the inside. What's interesting to us by way of packaging engineering, again, towards the packaging angle, is the Torah highlights how God blesses our containers and our kelim, our functional, practical vessels for cooking and for storage. I think that's pretty cool. I know my father, Hashem, would have loved that. Like, which vessels, which actual containers are mentioned as being blessed, and why those, and exactly what do we learn by what's mentioned, and were they really around, or was that a later addition to the text, and kind of whose version of those pots and pans, and how did they manufacture them? Was it a mass manufacture? Did they have a workshop for those, or did they have just one artisan? You know, the idea of the potter's wheel being a 3rd century BCE kind of invention, and the glass workshop being a 1st century BCE to 1st century CE reality. And so you can produce mass amounts of the same, and blow molding in glass. All those things were of deep interest to him by way of the history of these items, so that when we read these verses, we would say, okay, which version are we talking about? Well, vis-a-vis the basket, let me show you that the oldest basket in history was found. Can you see the basket now? I switched tabs. 10,500-year-old basket discovered and reported on just days ago. Just days ago, March 16, 2021. We found an intact 10,500-year-old basket. Wow. Wow, Jerusalem Post. Perfectly preserved large woven basket dating back some 10,500 years was unearthed in the Judean desert, the Antiquities Authority announced Tuesday. Experts believe the artifact is probably the oldest of its kind ever uncovered. Now, was that also a potential for the kind of package that they put their dough in? Was that what was called a kneading trough? When it wasn't wood, was it reeds from the Nile? Potentially, I would say that we could argue that such technology was around, and we might not know exactly whether or not we're talking about those wooden ones. But it does differentiate between baskets and kneading bowls. So then likely I could say, well, maybe by thinking about it in material history terms, the basket is one thing, and the kneading bowl is the other, mish'aratecha. And this was the same item that was mentioned in my going out of Egypt for the Exodus. The Malbim says in the kneading bowl, it could have been set upon their shoulders in order for the sun to bake the dough as they journeyed. This is the Malbim reading back into history, trying to understand how this functional item, which also was their package for it, actually helped them achieve what they wanted to, and that is to eat along the route and to journey, and for us to understand that it was the bread of the Exodus. It was the bread of not only affliction, but of the actual Exodus. Now, Rashbam, who's Rashi's grandchild, doesn't say that it's necessarily leftovers. Rashbam is often going to side with the more logical answer, and not just because his grandfather says something, does he accept it? Ibn Ezra, you know, already said it, but the Rashbam now, next generation will say also, Misharotam, the container in which the dough is placed while it is allowed to rise before being baked. And we know this from Deuteronomy, where we just read. So he is arguing that, in fact, it's the kneading bowl, and that the kneading bowl wrapped in the cloak, maybe that stopped the leavening process. Maybe it just didn't have any time to rise. They didn't add the yeast. Maybe they knew from adding yeast. And the container of their cloaks becomes what they went out of Egypt with. The bread basket normally means the place where the bread is stored. When I think about Deuteronomy, so then I want to just show you that all of these possibilities that have been teased out by Rashi, Ibn Ezra, and Rashbam, and the Malbim, all of these possibilities that, one, they put the leftovers in their cloak, two, that they put their kneading bowl in the cloak, or it was more like a trough instead of a bowl. All of those appear in a very famous dictionary of the Talmud and the Midrash. And if you're ever using the Jastrow dictionary for Talmud and Midrash and for Torah words that you want to figure out, sometimes you really feel like, woohoo, I've got a Jastrow bonus. And you see a reference to something you're studying, because he's going to bring up the definition of a word based on the passage that you're actually studying. And so kind of here, we got a Jastro bonus, and that is, he says, okay, what's a misheret? It's a baking trough or a dish, but it's also a possibility that it's the remainders, and that means the remnants. So definition one, definition two. We either wrapped the kneading bowl, less likely a basket, in our cloak, and we went out of Egypt, and we had a package for dough that had not yet risen, or we have leftover matzahs and dough, maybe, in a kneading bowl within the cloak. And that gets us to really, what does it mean that it is wrapped in their cloak? And does this wrapping in a cloak and what I'm reading in our verse in Exodus about taking the leftovers, taking the dough, taking the unleavened bread, does that influence and impact our experience of the Seder? And later on we'll ask, and does it influence exactly what we want to package up for our Seder experience? Stopping the share for a minute, going to a gallery view, unpinning the questions, comments, and before I go on. I can't see everybody, so anybody need a clarification? Anybody need a...
Not a clarification, but I was in thinking about the needs of packaging when we were getting out of the desert, right? You obviously have to think about moisture and sunlight. What we haven't talked about, which I would imagine also comes in with later packaging, is insects and other animals.
Good.
And how different, you know, wood versus a reed basket versus cloth, and then through the years, what materials were best both against moisture and against critters of all sizes and types.
Yeah. Yeah. So the idea that you protect it against insects and critters and those kinds of items that you didn't want, the foreign kind of what would make things tameh and unkosher, was a very big problem for our ancestors, and a very solution-oriented rabbinate came up with all kinds of solutions for the right kind of seals and wrappings in Mishnah Kelim. So you could use this kind of paste made from figs. You could use that kind of paste made from date honey, and you seal a jar this way, and you don't leave something uncovered, and you wrap it up tightly, and you don't want anything to get in. The idea of the loss of moisture is a very big issue. So do you use a water skin? And can you use water that's been in a water skin? All these kinds of things do come in terms of discussions by the ancients and in through the Mishnah period. So yes, those are important aspects. One very important thing is to not let the matzah become chametz, right? And have it be in touch with water longer than is allowed. That will be an important and essential aspect of matzah that keeps us actually from packaging matzah for Seder throughout millennia. You will hear authorities say one reason why we can't make it too early is because there's no way to keep this from becoming chametz. Only with the advent of modernity and machinery and boxes and seals do we have the kind of experience of protecting against that. One way that they could have protected against it in the early boxes is the same way, I'll go back to my share now, is the same way that the 1902 container of animal crackers was created. Remember those? With the little string, and you opened it up and you had the experience of taking the folds from the wax paper and you opened the box. Does everybody remember that experience? Well, that was an early thought for matzah but they were worried about those materials themselves leaching into matzah, and they decided not to use wax liners like Cracker Jack did after the Barnum's Animals crackers created their moisture-proof seal. Okay, so let's push on. The Egyptians urged the people and they hurried them out of Egypt. The idea of hurrying out of Egypt actually comes in this verse, chapter 12, verse 33 of Exodus. The Egyptians urged the people on, impatient to have them leave the country. They were worried that they were going to really get it. They knew the plague was coming. We shall be all dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, verse 34, their kneading bowls wrapped in their cloaks upon their shoulders. Interestingly, the Chizkuni, who is a 1220 to 1260 authority in France, he's the only one who relates directly to this packaging phrase, to this wrapping their matzah or dough in a bundle, in a cloak, in a garment, in a cloth. What he will say is, L'chach nahagu ha'olam l'teit ha'afikomen tachat ha'mapah. So now we get into packaging matzah at the Seder. Chizkuni relates directly to the notion that if they wrapped their dough in a cloak, however they wrap that, that's why today we wrap the afikomen in a serviette or a tablecloth or some covering. Now, even though serviette is used as the general word for a napkin in Britain, there are those who think that there were different kind of servers' towels that were a little longer in the medieval era. And when servers would use these longer towels, it would both protect their hands and give them the ability to kind of wrap hot dishes or food that they couldn't touch. And they could use parts of the cloth. I've actually had a conversation with curators who look at these samples I'm going to bring you now of 19th century, what they call banners for the Seder experience or towels. And I've suggested, based on halachic texts, that perhaps what we're looking at are leftover, what are called either cloths or serviettes or some type of wrapping that might have been used at the Seder experience. I want to know whether or not these tassels at the bottom of this one, for instance, are a later addition. Like when scribes add a next layer of text, I want to know whether or not just this serviette had use other than as a banner for a wall. These kinds of tassels are a late addition in many cases to tapestries starting around Renaissance times. This is a Romanian towel or serviette that I think might not have necessarily been only for the wall. This one on the far right is part of a set for a Seder experience, and people called this a towel for Nitilat Yadayim. I just don't see that as a towel for Nitilat Yadayim. I see that as serving a very different function, one that either a server or a Seder leader could use. And especially we have a halachic text, which I think sometimes curators overlook as possible informers for what our material objects are. We have a source in the 14th century from Rabbeinu Asher that says we should have enough cloth to cover the matzah on the bottom and the top. It should be totally wrapped like they wrapped their dough or their matzahs in their cloaks going out of Egypt. I have a feeling that there's more to discover in this realm, and I'm looking through collections now for Seder, quote unquote, long towels, and looking at the halachic sources in order to figure out whether or not some of them might have served the purpose of unique cloths made for Pesach, because you wouldn't want to use your challah covers, which were a little longer too, to be both bottom and atop challahs during that era. You couldn't use the chametz stick cloth. Meanwhile, 19th century Chinese Jews did indeed make special pockets for the afikoman with Chinese floral motifs and wonderful, wonderful kind of bags. Why did Chinese Jews do so? Because many had immigrated from Spanish lands and or other sections of the world of Jewish communities where the afikoman at least was wrapped. And in terms of the Seder containing matzah and the experience of matzah, it was at the afikoman that what was called the Hatzagat Yitziat Mitzrayim would be performed, a play of sorts where people would stand up, put their afikoman in a pouch or in a cloth over their shoulder, and walk around the table demonstrating to their children and their families, or for themselves, that they were leaving Egypt. In fact, it's the Rambam already, earliest halachic code we have post-Talmudic era, that says not that a person should simply see the matzah on the table, but a person should laharot la'atzmo. A person should show or demonstrate to him or herself and his or her family the actual going out of Egypt. So the Seder, it contains these matzahs on the table right from the start, as you know. There's also a container within a container, these afikoman wraps and covers, and that speaks to sacred experience. Sacred experiences oftentimes contain getting to the inner core and opening or unwrapping. In fact, think about services in general. We open the ark, unwrap the Torah, unroll Torah, read Torah, and experience it. The same goes for how we think about certain Seder experiences in ritual kind of theoretical ways. The Seder contains matzah, and that matzah at first in history, which I'm about to show you through illuminations, sits on the table. There's a debate about whether one should even cover it at the outset. It takes hold that we cover it at the outset as much as we cover the afikoman based on the Torah verse we learned earlier that our ancestors wrapped our dough and matzah in their cloaks. In Minhagei Yisrael, which is Daniel Sperber's incredible study of customs around the Jewish world, he writes that the Maharshal, a Middle Ages scholar, says, "Kasher rotze le'echol afikoman yotzi kamo shehayita betoch hamapa v'yishal shel la'acharav v'yelech kamo arba amot." A person should indeed take that wrapped afikoman, put it on his shoulder, and do this hatzagah, this small play, in order then to allow folks to know that he is reenacting the Exodus from Egypt. But what about that matzah that's on the table at the outset? Look at this funky modern matzah holder to differentiate between our round matzahs of yesteryear and shmura matzah and machine-made matzahs that have a unique place on the table. Having extra matzah at the table was not allowable by way of halakha at first. You did not have an extra box. You did not have an extra lucite container, Artie, who showed me one just before we started. You did not have even an extra lucite container for your shmura matzah that you could get at Eichler's. What you had was a Seder experience, and this is from the Erna Michael Haggadah, 1400 Germany, a Seder experience at which matzahs were featured. Here there are only two, begging the question, did they even have all three at every Seder? But it could be that this servant is holding two of them, this man is holding two of them, because we do have a little handle on this matzah, and certain illuminations from the Middle Ages highlight 1 and 2 and 3 little bumps on the outside of the circular matzahs to represent matzah number 1, matzah number 2, matzah number 3, or Cohen Levi Yisrael, as the tradition has it. Here on this table, you see no cover on the matzah. And just by way of interest, we do see a knife. We don't see a Seder plate per se. The knife may be representing the Paschal lamb, the Paschal offering. We do see bitters potentially in the hand of a servant, and we see that there's a wine pitcher in addition to a lamp overhead. They were interested in what kind of oils were used in their lamps in the ancient medieval world, because you didn't want to have any that would spoil the items on the table should that oil drop onto food. Nothing could create chametz, and you couldn't have anything unkosher. This uncovered matzah is represented in several illuminations. Uncovered matzah, don't we have Haggadahs of all types that say cover the matzah, uncover the matzah, put on the cover, take off the cover? In the Darmstadt Haggadah of the late 15th century, matzah cakes, matzah roundlets are on the table with no cover as well. And the Seder items, again, are not present, possibly because they're still using the minhag like they did in the Mishnaic times of bringing small tables or a small Seder plate to each individual at his or her leaning post, or this is a section of the Seder at which the table was made clear except from matzah, in order to bring a difference to the experience of eating. We put the food on the table, we take the food off the table. This was one methodology to actually engage children and Seder participants the night of. The Ashkenazi Haggadah, for the Halachma Anya section, early section of chanting about the matzah, is one of the first illuminations we have to highlight a Seder experience that has practically everything on the table and a covering over the middle of round matzahs. Here is a close-up of the Seder plate. You see that the covering actually does not stretch over the outside of the matzahs, adding to my theory that those longer towels of sorts might have been indeed some of the coverings that were in use in Ashkenaz in the 14th and 15th centuries. Look at this beautiful detail of the covering hanging over those round cakes that were most likely made hours before. There were no boxes, there were no Manischewitz, there were no bakery boxes with wrapped cakes delivered by friends. The only place we have stories of deliveries of such cakes were from the secret matzah bakeries in the Spanish lands during the Spanish Inquisition and the Portuguese lands, and then Brazil and the like. Back in this Middle Ages reality, there's no mention, just to go in passing, to say this source in passing, there's no mention by the Rambam when he codifies of covering the matzah. But the development of this practice of covering the matzah, as I showed you in the illuminations, is also related in the book Minhagei Yisrael by Daniel Sperber among the Middle Ages scholars, who include this halacha, this Jewish law, from one of our major scholars of the time. Mashma lichora she'ein tzorech b'kisayon shel hamatzot v'akerah. From the Rambam, it seems we don't have the need to cover the matzah. Shaharei lefi shitatam mevi'im et ha'ke'ara l'shulchan rak acharei ha'kiddush. The reason maybe is because we don't have to cover the matzah that's not on the table, yet we can make kiddush and then bring it. Thus, we have no need to cover the matzah. But this brings in a whole different area of thought. Why are we covering the matzah? Is it because of our ancestors taking their dough, taking their matzah, leaving Egypt and covering it with their cloak? Or is it for the same reason that we cover the challahs on Shabbos? Because we don't want the challahs to be slighted when we make the kiddush over the wine. This gets mixed together as two possible reasons why we do indeed cover: to not slight that which we didn't use for a blessing, or to commemorate some historical reality of how we packaged it going out of Egypt. The Maharil, he says, "V'yichro chamatzot b'mapa lechasot cherpat hapat." A Middle Ages halachic master says you do indeed need to wrap your matzah in a cloth so that you cover the majority of the actual matzah roundlet, knowing that the matzahs were round and that you didn't have cloth that was necessarily wide enough. I believe he made a practical halachic decision to say, just take the rectangular cloth, that longer servet, and put it across the matzahs, even if the two sides of the circle stick out from underneath it. The Torah, which is a 14th century source which blends Sephardic and Ashkenazic practices, because Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Asher, who writes it, moves from Spain to Germanic lands, he'll say the following: let's talk about our tables. They're bigger. They're bigger than our ancestors. So we set out everything from the beginning, rather than saying Kiddush, then bringing personal tables and matzah to each individual, like in the times of the Mishnah. Thusly, we put a cover on the challah or matzah at Pesach and make Kiddush, or say Kadesh at the Seder, so that we don't slight the bread or the matzah while we say Kiddush. He's going the direction of this notion of not slighting that which we're not using right away for the blessing. He goes into the reasoning about which species should really be first. When it comes to the 7 species mentioned in Deuteronomy, wheat is indeed mentioned before grapes. And so there's this whole argument in halakha, shouldn't we be saying the blessing over the bread first and then saying the blessing over the grapes? So let's not slight the bread, put the cover over it, make kiddush, and then go back and make your motzi. He doesn't mention the whole experience of going out of Egypt and wrapping it in cloth, but he does mention another reason why we might wrap it underneath and on top, and that is because it recalls the manna being delivered with heavenly dew atop the portions and sitting on heavenly dew below them. Nonetheless, so he doesn't mention the experience of wrapping the kneading bowl in the cloak, the matzah that's left over in the cloth, but he does mention the wilderness experience by mentioning how the manna was delivered and that both atop the manna and below it there was dew, and the cloth comes bottom and top to simulate this faith in God we have of receiving manna, God's continuing to deliver us in an Exodus experience in the wilderness by providing this manna protected by heavenly dew. If you take this source together, along with Chizkuni, who's the only commentator who talked about the afikoman being wrapped because of going out of Egypt, and you think about the matzah right from the start as also being wrapped in a sense, covered in a sense, because our ancestors covered the dough, covered their leftover matzah with a cloth, you've put together a wonderful collection of historical memory about the Exodus from Egypt as to why you cover and package your matzah at Seder. And you've also now, with the Torah, the 14th century, linked the whole notion of Kiddush and Shabbat and the way we make blessings over the species of Eretz Yisrael to think about the destination and the inheritance of the Jewish people, which the Seder also points to as well. Matzah covers in modernity, in Romania particularly, had beautiful stitching. And matzah covers got more sophisticated as those who worked with textiles became more expert or had more money to invest or had time or had machinery to create the kind of elements that they would use for matzah covers. Here you have a matzah cover, Romanian, and you see certain symbols on it. Keter, the crown, looks like a goat on top, if not a lamb on the side. You have these tabs on the bottom. And it doesn't seem like it's Cohen, Levi, and Yisrael there. And the question is, for what different communities had different symbolism for the matzah, we might not know them all. So we're still thinking and investigating about what those might be. This matzah cover also stitched and sewn, beautiful for the matzah itself. Is it for covering the matzah at the beginning with a little bit more of a round shape versus the rectangular towelette because people move towards covering the matzah entirely? We see that halacha calls for covering the matzah around the entire roundlet, the entire cake of matzah, versus just this kind of middle of the circle, leaving the two sides of the entire circle kind of out and bare, like we saw back here at the table. And here is another one stitched. These images, by the way, are taken from a wonderful book. I don't know if people know this book, but it's called The Art of Passover. And this particular one is, I'm going to tell you where this one's from, is undyed silk and cotton satin. It's at the Jewish Museum, and it's 19th century German. This kind of stitching was familiar to us on many wimples. Those are special kind of Torah ties made of fabric from the blankets of infants that were then made into Torah wrappings. Who knows if certain of the materials used for these matzah covers in Germany were also from the blankets of children or cloths used for children. This one is a matzah cover. You see Kohen, so that Hey Nun of the one above was really probably the last two letters of the word Kohen. But if it was Chet Nun, Chen, it might be that there was three different kind of faces of God that were symbolized in the matzahs, because inside these covers are 3 different pockets for the 3 different matzahs. And some authorities, starting in the 19th century, will say that in order to package the matzah at your Seder table, I want you to put it in a kind of bag, a cover that actually has 3 compartments versus just one cover itself. And so with textiles being what they were and the kind of sophisticated approach and the notion that you had 3 different matzahs that you needed to keep straight, which one's which, the inner compartment was divided, and certain books, halachic manuals, start to reflect the new packaging. Which came first? The divided matzah cover or the Jewish law that said divide between them with some piece of cloth or another mapah, another kind of pocket or napkin? I think it might have been that the material manufacturers drove Jewish law, and they saw doing the mitzvah in that ideal way with a napkin in between the 3 matzahs starting late 18th, 19th into 20th centuries. That's kind of ideal now and written when it comes to keeping your matzahs separate and covering them for the Seder, which we saw developed in the Middle Ages. This one happens to be a beautiful one that came out of Europe with Martha Bloom, who was a pharmacist in Czernowitz, and she was born in 1913. Long story short, in 1944, Martha paid to be smuggled on a train to Bucharest, Romania, and her parents joined her in 1945, and she had 5 pieces of gold with which to open a pharmacy, and she gave birth to her first child, Irene. Shout out to my mother. And the family immigrated to Israel in 1950 and then to Canada in 51. And this matzah cover was donated to the Holocaust Museum in Montreal in 2016 because her friend Carol Arcus would go to her place for Seder, and she was always hosted so beautifully by her dear friend Martha. And the museum took this to tell that story of her fleeing Nazi Germany, starting life anew, a bread of faith, a bread of faith, a cover that tells us about the story of a woman getting out of truly her own Egypt and into the promised lands of Israel and Canada, and a story of friendship and hosting. The bread of affliction, the bread of haste that our ancestors ate, they baked these unleavened cakes of the dough that they had taken out of Egypt, according to Exodus 12:39, for it was not leavened, since they had been driven out of Egypt and could not delay. And then we say, halach ma'anya, and we say, let all those who are hungry come and eat. Jonathan Sachs explains, Rabbi Sachs explains, that sharing food is the first act through which slaves become free human beings. One who fears tomorrow does not offer his bread to others, but one who is willing to divide his food with a stranger has already shown himself to be capable of fellowship and faith, the 2 things from which hope is born. That is why we begin the Seder by inviting others to join us. Bread shared is no longer the bread of oppression. Reaching out to others, giving help to the needy, and companionship to those who are alone, we bring freedom into the world. The 19th century halachic source says, indeed, the person who leads the Seder has covered matzah in front of him, breaks the middle matzah, and puts the afikomen in a napkin. And you have to make sure the napkin was not starched in laundering. Careful what you use so that you don't get any chametz. No cornstarch, no starches of any type. And why do you do that? To recall what is written, their leftover dough was wrapped in their clothes, was wrapped in their garment. As they packaged their matzah on the way out of Egypt, so too do we with our afikomen. We may cover it for the same reason or cover it as a sign of faith that we will get to the promised land. It's a bread of faith, and it's a bread that our ancestors have been eating in every generation. Haggadahs as a last stop along our route. Haggadahs package a matzah experience and present it to us to tell our story. It's a bread over which stories are told. Our story is told. The Pesach Seder is the package for the Haggadah. The Haggadah is yet another package of the representations and symbolism of the matzah, which is real on our tables and wrapped and covered and uncovered and broken and recovered and then taken out again. There's living in this container of Seder and unwrapping within the package of the Seder the inner packaging of what we need to make our history come alive. There is a story told in the Bird's Head Haggadah when we were being persecuted by Christians around us that we needed to be careful, that when it came to baking our matzah, it needed to be in public, that each of us from the matzah bakery could carry our matzah to our seders. And we revealed it publicly because they came to observe. Were we using blood? Were they pursuing us to strike us down like Pharaoh's armies? The Bird's Head Haggadah actually shows the moment of the matzah being carried in cloaks or cloths with the Egyptian, or if you will, Christendom pursuing us. That's an uprooting of the narrative of the Torah, because there's no time when the Egyptians really pursued us before we gave out dough or matzah or took it with us. This combines the idea of pursuit and matzah baking. It is against our matzah baking and our containing it for our Seder that we may be pursued, and we were pursued in Christendom. The Bird's Head Haggadah plays out this narrative. We shall be public about our matzah baking. We shall carry it with us like our ancestors and leave to make our own exodus or recreation of our exodus so that we can taste and experience God's freedom despite the threats around us. The Bird's Head Haggadah goes so far as to show the baking process, that the ingredients are pure, and that the matzahs are ready for Seder. Of course, they don't have corrugate boxes or even paper to wrap in. Moving back through time, our member Barbara Wolf highlights the very, very gift of wheat that God provides vis-a-vis the matzah in her illuminated work that was at the Morgan Library. But matzah is contained and boxed in our time and is quite public, and there are design-worthy containers all around us. We wait for those packages at Passover because they enhance the aesthetic. They contain what we need, our bread of affliction, our bread to tell stories over. This is an Israeli design of a tin for matzah, which highlights the manishtana and is quite beautiful in its black and white simplicity. The Rothschild miscellany showed matzah being baked in that way. We can imagine matzah being done by machines. We know that in certain parts of the world, Iran, 1970, the classic hand-baked matzahs, even bigger than life, were in the hands of children to excite them about the life and times and the stories of the Jewish people. At the 50th anniversary of Israel, Manischewitz came out with a collector's tin to indeed give us an airtight container for those new squared boards that we could keep on our Seder table, despite the fact that we're to have 3 in front of us covered to commemorate our ancestors packing them up in their cloaks and taking their dough or matzahs out of Egypt. We cannot miss the Exodus this year and the deeper meanings of matzah. but we for sure celebrate all the way back to the top the fact that in America, we made quite a difference when it came to packaging this holiday. Manischewitz to Streitz, to Yehuda matzahs from Israel, to Shmura that's imported, to boxed in Brooklyn. We know the look of this time period and how it's packaged, and that excites us in some way, parallel to the Seder experience itself.
Yasher koach.
Yasher koach, thank you.
So
I just
touched that you all came to share in the intersection of matzah packaging, our packaged experiences of Pesach. I would love your reflections. I would love your questions.
Rabbi, I loved on the Manischewitz box, in the very fine print, it says, sold by the package only.
Yes, that's beautiful.
But think about that. Were people inclined to buy three matzah squares, and that's it? I just found that very amusing.
Yes, definitely, right? And like the idea that you can't get this in your backyard by your neighbor or in the local matzah bakery. You can only get this by the package, and you might want it because it's so special. Right? They're really trying to market the experience and the mindset change.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Rabbi, I was just wondering, we think of matzah as a poor man's food, something you would probably feed to slaves, and it's humble beginnings. But in the Torah, Lot serves matzah to his guests, 400 years earlier. Was matzah ever considered like a normal bread that you ate all the time?
Yeah, so we studied on Monday at noon before Pesach, we studied that very verse and Rashi's commentary there and saw that hospitality, that really matzah is a bread of hospitality. And Lot insists that these angels, these guests, come and he gives them matzah. Rashi will say that the ugot, the cakes that Abraham and Sarah made back in Genesis, were also matzah. And so the idea that you have hospitality bread, that it can be kneaded quickly and put onto this dome or onto the ceramic dome or stone that's hot and made, very important for the history of matzah and what it might mean in our Seders. Though we don't say it's the bread of hospitality, you heard from Rabbi Sachs just now that halach ma'anya and opening our doors, really it is the bread of hospitality. It's not just the value of hospitality, but it's this bread we share. And so not so poor, but a wonderful notion of sharing this delight with the souls who come and who are hungry, friends who want to break bread together, as we know.
Thank you.
Benjamin.
Leon Cass has this new wonderful book, Found in God's Nation, Reading Exodus. Do you know about this?
Oh yes, Leon Cass's new book, yes.
So one of the things he says about the matzah is that...
Can you kind of speak into your microphone because it's a little low for me?
My terrible technology, I'm sorry. One of the things he mentions about matzah is that that it was in sort of rejection of the luxuries of the Egyptians.
Mm.
They were, known for their indulging and their high living, and that this was not necessarily, as we know it, only the bread of affliction, as it's called in the Haggadah, but just sort of a more modest and immediate thing that they were that prepared them for their freedom and to be out of Egypt.
Nice. That's a nice angle, that it's really in comparison and contrasting the kind of luxury and when you think about the menus that they said to God, like, hey, where's our fish? Where's our fresh vegetables? That this was just basic staff of life and that we could live on that. And we didn't need that Nile basin and Goshen goodness. Nice.
I just wondered, could you clarify, did you say that when the matzah became square. Was that an American invention to have the matzah square and be much more, mass produced? Before that, they were all round?
Between the Industrial Revolution in Britain and the cracker companies producing those early crackers and the Streitz company and Manischewitz companies, that was really revolutionary by way of the beginnings of square matzot. There's a British company that's been around for a long time called Rakuzins. And if anybody's ever eaten British matzah, they actually had a funny thing back in 2018. They apologized because I think it was their packaging and not necessarily the quality of their cracker, which they insist didn't change, but it came that it was so crummy that so many customers called them and said, "Your matzah's all crumbs this year. It's all broken. It's all broken." I have a feeling that they didn't have a great packaging engineer think about pallets and distribution and the way it was all wrapped. So you want my diagnosis. But yes, the idea is that machine matzahs start and they're cut into squares and they're boxed into squares in late 19th, early 20th century, and it creates a stir. But you find then packages, and as Diane pointed out, you're only sold by the package. Here it is, the square package, and it's squared off matzah. And they asked whether or not it was kosher.
I just wanted to add, and I wanted to add one more thing, is that I have often looked at images, paintings of the Last Supper to see whether or not it looks like there's matzah on the table. And I will tell you, in many images, like Leonardo da Vinci, I think, it looks much more like bread than matzah. So it's kind of interesting whether this is a Christian take on it, or I'm not sure. It should be matzah at the Last Supper, but it most of the time looks like bread.
I want to say that we should be so healthy as a community. Please God, everybody should have good health who needs it, before Shlema to those who are in need. We should get together on Pesach Sheni, and I'll make the 5 cakes of Syrian soft matzah that I got this year, because I saved 1 box for Pesach Sheni. And we should have soft matzah and vodka together so that you can try this. And I'm telling you that this matzah, if Bobby, you're the expert about what's in the yard or not, but if matzah could be soft throughout the ages, like I had with the Moroccan chamsas that were literally soft little Moroccan chamsas for your Seder plate, you put right in front of you, and right in front of your plate, 3 little matzahs that were shaped like chamsas, soft and yummy. They were, I hate to say yummy, like delicious. Like you want that every year because they're so soft and delicious. These Syrian ones, I wouldn't say delicious is the word, but they're soft, and they behave more like a laffa than they do like a matzah, like either the round or the square that we know. And so I could see the smaller ones being more like pita, because there are matzahs that they make that size as well. So not a mystery that they could have had those, and that could have been unleavened cakes.
Okay.
Rabbi,
the idea of the packaging, which initiated the discussion, is also interesting because it creates the aesthetics of the packaging and how it was designed and how it was worded, and the topography and the colors and the layout was really a marketing vehicle to appeal to the shopper who would look at this and say, boy, this looks appealing. And I wonder, pardon?
No doubt about it.
Yeah. And so I wonder if that began to take on the real appeal, maybe overshadowing the actual quality of the taste. And we happen to like Streitz, and Hurwitz and Margaretten doesn't come close to it, but certainly it's a way to attract attention in a very appealing way.
Well, the history of labeling or what you print on boxes is an interesting one by way of packaging design and how the marketers interface with packaging engineers. How much of the actual product am I going to picture on the box itself? Because one initial concern, 1870s, 80s, 90s, being a student of this packaging history and the design of packages and what they put on the boxes, one major concern is that people are not going to trust what's behind cardboard. Before, you went into your grocer and you got to see exactly what you were buying. They wrap it up in front of you. They keep it in the glass jar. You put your eyeballs on such a thing. The newer products that especially are behind wrappers for freshness, this creates all kinds of stir. What winds up happening is the unique marketing angle of premium gifts. Try our product 3 times, write in and get a special, whether it's a package of jellyfish from this a special candy, or it's some other little useful household product that you can also take home with you, because they are trying to convince people that packaging doesn't hide, that in fact it enhances. And so that's a debate through the early part of the 20th century with packagers, marketers, product. If you look at the history, particularly of Streitz and Manischewitz, which I started to do based on this issue, different years of the package or time periods of the packaging highlight the actual product itself and picture the product on the outside of the box versus just use color and font. And I think you can kind of parallel those to different kind of design orientations of different times. You can say like this was a more kind of era that they were interested in fancy cursive writing and blues and browns coming together versus actually picturing the product and getting into the realism of what was in it. And you can see that on lots of things. Like for instance, I looked at a history of jelly labels. This is the kind of stuff that I do sometimes as the lines of inquiry and tangents come about. And so you have some jellies that have fruits on them to show you that, yes, there's real fruit in here. But sometimes the jelly is just fancy script with no fruit on it at all. And it looks so elegant because the wording, and it sits on your shelf, and that wording is what's going to really attract you, and the trust it builds and the kind of relationship you have is at stake. So these are really interesting packaging design questions. Jay, what were you going to say?
Is there a halachic minimum concerning the size of the matzahs that are used at the Seder and or the quantity of dough that has to be used to make one?
Yeah, so the idea that you have, let me just call it up, a size of matzah measure is approximately 26 cubic centimeters, which is a nice number because that's the number of Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey, Adonai, if you do gematria. If you like gematria. If you don't like gematria, that's up to you. But 26 cubic centimeters. The idea that the OU has a nice article on that, Jay, called All in Good Measure that I looked at earlier today. Rabbi David Bistreicher, the kazite of a matzah, there's a little bit of an argument about how much that exactly was at the time of the Beit HaMikdash and whether or not that carries through to today. So if you want to do 26 cubic centimeters as a basic measure, you could kind of see a square within the circle as well to know if you've got something big enough, right? Or if you've got kind of a double layer of the thin board, you could kind of measure it out. They came out actually with years back. I don't know who has the set, but there's actually a kind of plastic sheet that you can put down on the table, and you can compare your matzah board with the minimum required amount of a standard kind of thickness matzah board. When I was in Jerusalem in 1994 and 95 with Rabbi Benjamin Zivloni and Bruria and family, you had scales for everything and measuring sticks for everything.
Right. Okay. Well, so is the important criterion the amount of dough used to make the piece, or the actual size of the piece? And if in either event, where does that kazite come from? Especially if it's the size, where would the 26 cubic centimeters be?
Yeah, I mean, if you really want to get into the details, Star K has a Kazais measurement kind of chart, and they'll tell you that the approximate size of a golf ball is about the minimum you can have for the dough. So that's the best kind of measurement. So if you take the golf ball and you slap it on and it was a little thicker versus if you roll it out and it's thinner, that's the minimum. But you want to have more than that. And you should have 2 Kazites according to some, 4 Kazites according to others. It just really depends on who you're going by if you're interested in these kind of measuring sticks.
So
I had a
Scott-
question. What in one of the earlier boxes showed the Manischewitz matzahs, it said American matzahs. And I don't know if that was the first, but I don't think that must have been from 100 years ago, because you'd never write you say Passover matzahs. Obviously, the Israelis say Israeli matzahs. I just thought they're trying to say it's matzahs, but it's good for an American Jew to eat. I thought that was the interesting thing.
Yeah, that's fascinating, right? Because they Minhag America becomes a big discussion, Jonathan. So if we were to look at how many Jewish either products or books or membership forms, this is a little bit of an area that there's a fantastic scholar, Amy, maybe you remember her name. She was our teacher at the UJ. She did the class about American Jewish history. So if you think about it, she was a wonderful historian. She talked about this period of Minhag America developing. And people thought for a while that we would get out of the Ashkenazic Sephardic kind of routine and that we would move towards a Minhag America. And that Minhag America would kind of take over. And the more we can label things American, the more in sources, sages might say, Aval haderech ha'amerikait, the American way of doing it is this. We don't have to necessarily abide by European traditions. You know, for instance, there's a big debate. I've done this class before. Can you eat turkey on Thanksgiving? You know, so in America, since they had a tradition already that some guy brought a turkey to Europe and somebody ate it in Europe and then came back and now we eat it. Like, that's one way of thinking about Americans have this tradition from Europe. But another guy could say, well, we're in a new land. Here's a fowl. Looks like we know exactly what kind of birds we can eat from Torah. Let's just say that this is a kosher bird. That could be an American way of thinking in a new chapter of Jewish history. They didn't need to rely on the old ways. So a little bit of that is more polemical and or more opportunistic than you think, Jonathan, because I think they're trying to establish it. So you're hitting on something that really interested sages at the time, and some of the founders of the original group that would be kind of anti-Yiddish but not so reformed, that turned into the Jewish Theological Seminary crowd, who were completely for, by the way, maintaining Jewish law, Shulchan Aruch, the whole way Jewish law was essential and important. They were talking about Minhag America as well, Zacharias Frankel and that crowd. So very important by way of timelines of history and what we notice on those Jewish products. What were we going to say, Mom?
I was going to say that the packaging, I do remember, well, you won't remember, but many, many years ago, maybe 30, 40 years ago, when I think it's Strite, was it Strite's factory that was in the Lower East Side?
Yes, and then they
they used to give tours
yes.
of the Matzah bakery. So I had taken classes there. And I mean, one of the obvious things that we learned from that tour was that you can't forget that making something American was also a financial boon for the company, right? So if you encouraged American matzah, and the reason that it had to go into square boxes and couldn't stay round anymore was because of the assembly line, and the tool that was used to aerate the matzah was oblong. And so if you assembly line that process and then you could put the square pieces in a box, that was so much more economical than any other way to do it. And so, I think that the process of economics and the idea of Americanizing matzah went hand in hand.
Ladies and gentlemen, my mother is not a Marxist. But if you think that the end of redemption history is happening because we're here in America and the machinery of matzah has commoditized it, and therefore we've really come to this place, this could be a really interesting Marxist take on Pesach, Mom. No,
Well,
but,
I didn't mean it in that way, though.
No. I know that. I think it's beautiful to always think about in terms of like the economics and what the economic drivers are and where that's leading. It's just funny to think that, you know, it could be part and parcel with, you know, the commoditization of religion. And in fact, I'm tongue in cheek here. I mean, if I really start to think about this and we start to think about what Marx might have said about the commoditization of religion and the whole marketplace kind of boom, and that everybody can kind of afford it, and that it's going to be spread out, and that it's going to lose some meaning because we're not actually putting our hands to it anymore, and it's not done in the kind of cultural reality, and that there's no more like a nobility to it, you know, like that could be a little worrisome, right? And we could think about it as an assembly line worry that we have in our lives. But on the other hand, like there's something really exciting for me, like when I walk into the store and I find my blue and brown box of Strites whole wheat matzah, and it's the one for Pesach, and it's not the year-round one. Like that excites me, and you know that kind of thing excited Dad. It excited my father, Olav Shalom, to walk in and see the seasonal package and know that something was happening in the marketplace of humanity and the cultural marketplace of humanity. And so that's kind of cool, like an aesthetic that really tells you you're part of something grand. So there is
and people bought it, and people, I mean, even here in the villages we have square boxes of lots of different kinds of matzah. Not much other Passover food, but we do have matzah. Right.
Well, I have to tell you, it's 9:15 already, and I know it's getting a little late. I am so grateful for being able to share this passion I have with you. Le'ilui nishmato shel Avi, Mori, Shmulev ben David Vayeta, for my father's 25th yard site. This has been a most meaningful time, despite the fact that we can't be together in person. I want to wish you continued sweetness on Pesach, meaningful matzah eating every time you go to one of those wonderful packages of matzah, however you have it around. And Chag Sameach. See you maybe tomorrow for Minyan, maybe for Yizkor, maybe for Zooming in, maybe for Shabbos itself. But anyway, let's see each other soon and learn together again. So grateful for you being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yes, thank you.
Shakach.
Bruchim to you. Bruchim to you.
Good night.
Good night. Good night.
Night, everybody.
Good night.